In the year 1847, under a pale southern sun that warmed the land but never its conscience, the auction yard of Blackwood County filled with men who spoke of human lives the way merchants spoke of grain. Prices were whispered, laughed at, and argued over, while shackled souls stood silently, already aware that their fate would be decided not by character, but by convenience. It was there among broken shoes, torn dresses, and eyes dulled by knowing too much that a young girl stood unnoticed. She was small, thin, no more than 14 by the looks of her hands rough from labor she should never have known. No one asked her name. Names had no value here. The plantation master who would change her life did not arrive with cruelty in his eyes. That was the lie he would later tell himself. His name was Thomas Caldwell, owner of Red Hollow Plantation, a man respected in public, feared in private, and praised in churches where no enslaved person was allowed to pray beside him. He had come to the auction that day not out of need, but convenience. One of his older field workers had collapsed and died the previous week. The overseer had suggested buying another cheap, young, replaceable. Thomas listened. He always did. The girl was nearly overlooked, too thin, too quiet, no strength that could be immediately advertised. When the auctioneer called for bids, the crowd barely responded. A few men scoffed. One muttered that she wouldn't last a season. Another laughed and turned away. The price fell rapidly, insultingly low. 19 cents. That was the final call. Thomas raised his hand, almost absent-mindedly. The hammer fell. A life was sold for less than the cost of a loaf of bread. She did not cry when the chains were removed from the platform. She did not plead. She simply followed, barefoot, as Thomas mounted his horse and the overseer led her toward the wagon. There was something unsettling in her silence, something Thomas noticed but refused to name. On the ride back to Red Hollow, dust clouded the road, and the girl sat still, her eyes fixed not on the land ahead, but on the ground beneath her feet, as though memorizing every step in case she ever needed to run. Red Hollow Plantation was vast and orderly, its white columns polished, its fields stretching endlessly. To visitors, it looked like prosperity. To those who lived behind the slave quarters, it was a slow-moving grave. The girl was given a coarse dress, a new number, and a place among the others. Still, she spoke little. She worked harder than expected, endured punishment without sound, and never looked Thomas in the eyes. The overseer approved of her obedience. Thomas approved of her silence. Weeks passed, then months, and slowly, something began to disturb the order Thomas relied upon. The girl, now called Eliza by the household, though no one knew if it was truly her name, began to show knowledge she should not have had. She could read small words on crates. She understood instructions before they were finished. Once, when Thomas's wife fell ill, it was Eliza who quietly suggested a remedy using herbs growing near the creek, an old remedy Thomas's own mother had once used. The coincidence unsettled him. At night, Thomas began to dream, dreams he had not had in years. A woman's voice calling his name, a child crying in the distance. A memory he could never fully see, only feel warm, painful, familiar. He dismissed it as guilt, though he had never allowed himself to believe guilt applied to men like him. The truth began to surface on a rainy afternoon when Thomas ordered old records brought down from the attic, birth logs, purchase receipts, inheritance documents yellowed with age. He was searching for something unrelated, but as fate often works, it led him where he least wished to go. A torn page fell loose from a ledger dated 20 years earlier. On it was the record of a woman sold quietly, privately, no auction. Her name was Sarah. The note beside it was brief but damning. House servant, personal matter, child unrecorded. Thomas's hands trembled. He remembered Sarah. Everyone did. She had belonged to his father. She had disappeared suddenly, sent away without explanation. Rumors had circulated, but nothing had ever been confirmed. Thomas had been young, then old enough to remember, old enough to understand more than he had admitted. That night, Thomas watched Eliza from the shadows as she worked. Her eyes, her posture, the shape of her face. They matched memories he had buried so deeply he had convinced himself they were dreams. When he finally spoke to her alone, his voice was not that of a master, but of a man standing on the edge of a truth that could destroy him. He asked her about her mother. Eliza did not hesitate. She told him her mother's name had been Sarah, that she had died on another plantation, that before she died, she had told Eliza one thing, that her father lived in a white house with columns and that his name was Thomas. That he would never save her, but one day he would know. The room did not simply fall silent. It closed in. Even the walls seemed to listen as the truth settled. Time folded inward, crushing decades into a single breath. The number echoed in Thomas's skull, 19 cents, over and over, like a verdict spoken by something far older than law. He had not just bought a child. He had bought his own blood. He had stripped her of a name, burned a number into her existence, worked her hands raw, and fed himself from her obedience. And now the truth stood before him, cold and unmovable, leaving nowhere to hide. Thomas did not scream. Screams were for men who still believed escape was possible. He sank into the chair as if gravity itself had finally claimed him. The authority he had carried his entire life drained away, turning to ash in his chest. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the unbearable realization that everything he had built rested on a crime that could never be undone. Eliza did not move. She watched him with eyes that held no anger and no mercy, only distance. The kind of distance earned by those who survive long enough to stop waiting for justice. Long enough to understand that truth does not always heal. Sometimes it only condemns. What followed was not redemption. History does not reward men like Thomas with absolution. He freed her quietly, unlawfully, as though secrecy could lessen the weight of what he had done. He arranged her escape north under a false name, convincing himself that silence was penance. He never confessed. He never faced judgment. He continued to live inside the house raised by suffering, where every hallway whispered and every night carried footsteps that were no longer there. Eliza never looked back. They say Thomas died years later alone, speaking apologies to corners of empty rooms, flinching at sounds no one else could hear. Others claim Red Hollow Plantation was abandoned, swallowed by weeds and silence, as if the land itself refused to remember him. But the truth remains etched deeper than rumor, deeper than history. A man once believed a human life was worth 19 cents, until he realized he had purchased his own reflection. And by then, it was far too late.